They brought their children. That is the detail that stops you. Not the gallows, not the condemned man standing on the platform with a rope around his neck. The detail that makes you understand what the American frontier actually was, what it required people to become, is the children in the crowd, sitting on their father's shoulders, eating food from picnic baskets, watching a man die in a town square on a Tuesday afternoon, as though it were a county fair. This was not exceptional. This was ordinary. This was how the Wild West worked. From the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, across the sprawling territories that would eventually become American states, communities operated on a justice system that had almost nothing in common with what we recognize today. No established courts, no professional law enforcement, no prisons capable of holding serious offenders, no institutional infrastructure of any kind. What they had was each other, the memory of legal systems from back east, and the practical understanding that in a place this large and this empty, fear was the only law enforcement tool that could be everywhere at once. So they built a justice system out of fear, and they built it in public, where everyone could see it, because that was the entire point. To understand how this worked, you have to understand what the frontier actually was, logistically. These were not towns in the modern sense. They were collections of buildings, sometimes fewer than 200, scattered across territory that could take days to cross on horseback. A sheriff, if there was one, might be responsible for an area the size of a small eastern state. Communication traveled at the speed of a horse. A crime committed 50 miles away might not be known for a week. Under these conditions, the visible punishment of wrongdoers served a specific, calculated purpose. Every person who witnessed a flogging or a branding or a hanging carried the memory of it with them back to wherever they came from, and that memory did the work that the absent sheriff could not. It was a distributed system of deterrence. Every witness became a broadcast tower. Before courthouses existed at all, justice traveled, wagon train companies moving west, appointed counsels from their own ranks, judges, juries, and executioners drawn from the same group of pioneers they would rule over. These traveling tribunals handled everything from property disputes to murders, often reaching a verdict within hours of the offense. They had to. You couldn't stop a wagon train for days to conduct a proper legal proceeding. The territory ahead didn't care about your schedule, and neither did the weather, so you reached a verdict quickly, carried out the sentence immediately, and moved on. For minor crimes, these councils ordered mediation or restitution. For crimes of violence, the sentence was typically physical and public. When murder occurred on the trail, emigrants would select jurors who stood in a semicircle around the accused as their fellow pioneers watched a deliberate effort to replicate the courtroom procedure they remembered from back east, stripped of everything that made that procedure slow, and keeping only the parts that made it legitimate. The speed of this system became legendary in its own time. In 1859, in Denver, then a settlement of approximately 150 buildings, not yet incorporated, not yet a proper town by any formal standard, a man named John Stoffel murdered his brother-in-law for gold dust. He was convicted and hanged within 48 hours of the crime. That settlement of 150 buildings managed to draw 1,000 spectators to the execution. 1,000 people came to watch, in a place with 150 buildings, because the execution was the most important civic event that had occurred there, possibly ever. It communicated something the settlement needed its residents to understand, that even here, even in this barely formed cluster of structures in the middle of the territory, there were lines you did not cross. The judges who operated in this environment developed reputations that functioned as their primary professional credential. Isaac C. Parker, known to history as the hanging judge, presided at Fort Smith, Arkansas, for 21 years. During that time, he sentenced 160 men to death by hanging. 79 of those sentences were actually carried out. The others died in custody, had sentences commuted, or were granted retrials. Parker was not a sadist. He was a man who understood that his jurisdiction, which covered 74,000 square miles of Indian Territory in western Arkansas, could only be governed through the credibility of his sentences. People had to believe that if you came before Isaac Parker and were convicted of a capital offense, you would hang. That belief was his law enforcement infrastructure, more effective than any number of deputies he could never have afforded anyway. But hanging was the end of the spectrum. Between the minor offense and the capital crime lay a range of punishments that modern people encounter, mostly in history books, but which were, to the people who lived under them, as familiar and expected as traffic tickets are to us. Branding. The practice came from livestock management. The same hot iron you used to mark your cattle, as yours could be used to mark a person as something specific: a thief, a runaway, a liar. The logic was the same as the livestock logic. You marked something permanently, so that anyone who encountered it later would know its history, without having to ask. In 1790, in Jonesboro, Tennessee, two men convicted of horse stealing, John Wilson and Joseph Folsom, were brought to the pillory. They received 39 lashes each. Then a hot iron was applied to their right cheeks, burning the letter H into the skin. Then the left cheek, the letter T, H for horse thief, T for thief. The letters would remain on their faces for the rest of their lives, announcing their crime to every person they met in every town they ever entered. Horse theft, specifically, was treated with extraordinary severity on the frontier, and it's important to understand why. In an environment without vehicles, without reliable supply lines, without any form of transportation other than animal power, a horse was not a luxury, it was survival infrastructure. Stealing a man's horse in the wrong circumstances could leave him stranded in terrain that would kill him, could leave his family stranded, could strand a wagon with everything he owned. Horse theft was treated almost as a form of attempted murder, because in many frontier conditions, that's functionally what it was. The severity of the punishment was calibrated to the severity of the threat. The branded faces of Wilson and Folsom, walking into any new town, were advertisements that required no printing, no distribution, no literacy to read. The letters said everything. Communities that encountered these men knew immediately, permanently, irreversibly, who they were dealing with. They could make their own decisions accordingly. The Virginia court in 1640 that sentenced a runaway slave to be branded with the letter R in his cheek was operating on the same logic, applied to the same fundamental concern, controlling movement and identifying those who had violated the social order. But the social order it was protecting was a profoundly different and unjust one. The branding iron did not distinguish between its applications. It served whoever held it, and whatever social hierarchy that person represented. Then there was the whip. The crack of a leather whip in a town square was so common a sound in frontier settlements that it would not have drawn particular attention on its own. You needed to be close enough to see the post and the person tied to it to understand what was happening. Whipping posts stood in town squares across the frontier, the way bulletin boards stand in town squares today, a fixture of civic infrastructure, serving a specific and expected function. The instrument varied. Simple leather was common. The cat-o'-nine-tails, a handle with multiple thongs, sometimes knotted or weighted at the ends, appeared in more serious cases. Both produced welts. The cat produced something worse. Its multiple thongs could intersect on impact, crossing previous welts, building a geography of damage on a person's back that a single thong could not match. The number 39 had a specific origin. Biblical law established 40 stripes as the maximum punishment, and the tradition that developed was to administer 39, one less than the biblical maximum, as a hedge against accidental death. The concern was not primarily humanitarian. A person who died under the whip had been deprived of the rest of their sentence, and the community had been deprived of the deterrent effect of seeing that sentence completed. The 39 lashes were calibrated to damage without killing, to produce the maximum impression on the watching crowd, while keeping the offender alive to carry that impression with them afterward. A reader of the Raleigh Register in 1846 described witnessing the flogging of two men in terms that suggest he was unprepared for what he saw, even knowing what he was going to see. Each man's back, left rough with welts and covered with blood, after the 39 lashes. The detail that stays with you in his account is not the blood but his surprise. This was legal. This was official. This was carried out by public servants as part of the formal justice system, and it still shocked a person who had come specifically to observe it. On the wagon trains moving west, flogging was essentially the maximum sentence for serious crimes short of death, because the wagon train had no other option. You couldn't imprison someone on a moving wagon train. You couldn't confine them. You could expel them, which in some terrain was a death sentence, or you could whip them in front of everyone and let them walk it off and continue with the journey. The public nature of the punishment on a wagon train was absolute. There was nowhere else to conduct it. Everyone witnessed everything. That totality of witness was itself part of the sentence. What whipping had over branding was the possibility of concealment. A back could be clothed. The scars, while lasting, were not visible to someone meeting you on the street. This gave flogging a different social valence. It was a punishment that could, in theory, be left behind if you moved far enough and didn't take your shirt off. Some offenders managed it. The memory of the public humiliation was harder to leave behind than the physical marks, but the physical marks at least offered the possibility of a new beginning somewhere. No one knew you. Branding did not offer that possibility. Ear cropping did not offer that possibility either. The practice of removing parts of a person's ears, or nailing them temporarily to a wooden board before cutting them free, arrived in the American frontier as a direct inheritance from colonial, legal practice, which had inherited it from English common law, which had been practicing it for centuries as a punishment for everything from forgery to sedition. The frontier didn't invent this. It simply continued it in a context where the alternatives were limited and the need for permanent visible consequences was acute. In Charles County, Maryland, in 1755, a young black woman convicted of perjury was brought to the pillory, flogged, and had her ears cropped close. The combination of punishments, pillory, flogging, cropping, was common because the pillory served as the delivery mechanism for the other two. You were fixed in place, unable to move, for the entire duration of what was being done to you, and for the required period of public display before and after. In Nashville, in 1793, the first horse thief tried under the Cumberland Compact, the legal code governing what would become Tennessee, received the full range of available punishments in combination: 1 hour in the stock, 39 lashes, ears severed, and cheeks branded. This was not extraordinary cruelty. This was the legal maximum applied to what the community considered the most serious property crime, and every element of the sentence served the same communicative function. When this man walked out of Nashville and into the next settlement, his body was a complete legal record. Nothing about his history required anyone to read documents or consult court records. The record was on his face and on the sides of his head. The psychological literature on shame and social exclusion didn't exist in 1793, but the people designing these punishments understood intuitively what that literature would later confirm. Permanent visible marking created permanent social exclusion, and permanent social exclusion was in some respects a more severe long-term punishment than the physical pain of the initial sentence. You could recover from pain. You could not recover from being immediately recognizable as a branded horse thief in every room you entered for the rest of your life. The gallows, when they finally appeared in frontier settlements, were civic infrastructure in the most literal sense. Territorial governments paid for them from public funds. An 1849 invoice from the Santa Fe County District Court shows that a single execution cost the equivalent of more than $4,500 in today's money: lumber, labor, rope, coffin, and various materials. This was a significant public expenditure, and it was treated as one, because the hanging was understood as a public service, not just a punishment. George Malladon, known as the Prince of Hangmen, operating under Isaac Parker's jurisdiction, treated his craft with the professional seriousness of an engineer. His ropes were 1.5 inches thick. He soaked them in water, dried them in air, then treated them with tallow or soap to achieve precisely the right combination of weight and flexibility. The knot was placed on the left side of the condemned person's neck, which experience had shown produced unconsciousness most rapidly by striking a specific cluster of nerves during the drop. Maladon oversaw at least 60 executions over 2 decades, and he was proud of his work in the way that a professional is proud of doing a difficult job correctly. The condemned were given final words. This too was not sentiment. It was a specific piece of theater that served the deterrence function. A man who had killed and robbed and been convicted, and was now standing on the gallows, saying whatever final thing he chose to say before the drop, was communicating something about the entire system, that it had processes, that it had stages, that it was not arbitrary mob violence, but formal institutional procedure. The final words were part of the ceremony that legitimized what was about to happen. In 1850, one of 5 Cayuse Native Americans hanged in Oregon Territory spent his final words asking whether the missionaries who had taught him Christianity had not also taught him that Christ died to save his people. The question didn't save him. It did survive him. Polybius was at the Carthage siege taking notes. Someone was at this hanging, doing the same. Even in death, the frontier's justice system could fail in ways that became part of the historical record. Black Jack Ketchum, hanged in 1901 in Clayton, New Mexico, provides the most dramatic example. The calculation of drop length relative to body weight was wrong, and during the execution, Ketchum's head separated from his body. This was not intended. The execution was intended to be a clean, professional, institutionally legitimized procedure. The miscalculation transformed it into something that the witnesses carried with them for the rest of their lives as an image they could not unsee. It entered the historical record because history records the things that went wrong alongside the things that went right, and sometimes the things that went wrong tell you more about the world that produced them. What connects all of these practices, the branding, the flogging, the cropping, the hangings, is the audience. Every single one of these punishments was designed to be witnessed. Every one of them was incomplete without the crowd. The crowd was not incidental to frontier justice. The crowd was the mechanism. The crowd was what made a punishment into a deterrent, what turned a physical act performed on one person into a message delivered to 1,000. The children in those crowds eating from picnic baskets, watching men hang from the gallows in town squares, they were not there in spite of the grimness of what was happening. They were there because of it. Their parents brought them specifically so they would remember, so the lesson would take. The frontier demanded that kind of bluntness, because it had nothing else. No prison system, no professional police force, no communications infrastructure, no institutional redundancy of any kind. It had the memory of the crowd, and it used that memory the way other systems used walls and bars and patrol cars. It wrote its laws in the bodies of the people who broke them, and then displayed those bodies to everyone who remained. As territories formalized into states and state institutions developed the capacity to incarcerate, the visible punishments faded. They became embarrassments, relics of a time when civilization was thinner. The whipping posts came down, branding was abolished, the public hangings moved indoors, then ended. The justice system, in developing institutional capacity, moved its violence out of public view. Whether this represented moral progress or simply the refinement of concealment is a question that depends entirely on what you think the purpose of punishment actually is. The frontier never had the luxury of that ambiguity. It punished in public because it had no other option, and it made sure the children watched because the children were the point. That's the kind of history that stays with you long after you close the tab. If you want more of it, History Digger is where it lives. Subscribe and you won't miss what's coming next.